What is going on YouTube? I'm Lamont at large. Today I'm in Greenbrier County, West Virginia with a question to ask any and all watching right now. Did a young woman's spirit really come back from the grave to visit her mother, to identify her killer? You be the judge. Let's talk about it. I'm going to take you back in time. Let's go to the 1870s, right here in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. A young girl is born in 1876 by the name of Zona Heaster. She grows up in the county. She could be described as a young, spirited woman. It's 1896, and she's a young, spirited woman with a child. Not married, having it, of course, out of wedlock. Back in the old days, it was considered uncouth to have a child out of wedlock. Of course, especially when you were a woman, you were almost considered a form of a social pariah. Hey, I don't make the rules when it comes to those sort of things. I simply just choose not to follow them. So she has a child, and eventually she meets a man 10 years her senior by the name of Erasmus Shue. He is referred to around town as simply Trout. He is a blacksmith. He takes a liking to Elva, and heck, I'll raise your kid. I like the little bugger, whatever he tells her. So they shack up, they get married, and they move in together. Everything is going fine so far, right? So Elva one day starts feeling a little unwell. She ain't feeling too hot. She's been not feeling good for about a week. It's going into 2 weeks. Every day she wakes up and she seems to always want to throw up. And she's always constantly nauseous. And she's always constantly tired. Uh-oh, she's been through this before. She's pregnant. We didn't really have pregnancy tests back then. The test was, well, it was a woman's intuition. Instinct, if you will. She starts showing a little bit of a baby bump. Oh, I'm going to have another child, and this time it's going to be in marriage, like the Lord says it should be, right? The morning of January 24th, 1897, Trout goes to work, working at a blacksmith shop. As he's walking down the road, he stops by a house where a young kid named Andrew Jones lived. Andrew, his age, I'm not really sure, but he would often do chores for the Shues here and there. He goes to the home and tells Andrew, listen, go to the house and gather all the eggs in the hen house, and then afterwards, see what Elva needs you to do around the house. For an unknown reason, instead of him going directly to the house, Andrew lollygags. Maybe he doesn't want to that particular day. Maybe he would rather stare at birds or poke things with a stick. Whatever the case might be, he eventually arrives to the house, opens the door, and finds Elva lying on the floor by the stairs, on her back, one arm at her side, and another arm across her chest. He calls out to her. She doesn't answer. He immediately runs out of the house, runs back to the blacksmith shop, not back, but to the blacksmith shop, and alerts Erasmus, or Trout as he's commonly referred to, that Elva is on the floor and she's not moving. I called her name and she's not answering me. He immediately goes to the house and then finally manages to contact a doctor. Dr. Knapp is the local physician in the area. Now, we don't have 911 back in the 1890s. Most of us still do not have telephones. By the time a doctor arrives, it's the better part of the workday that is over. When Dr. Knapp arrives, he sees Elva dressed, not moving. Erasmus, or Trout again, like he's referred to, says, hey, she's dead. And so the doctor goes to, touch her, see if she's cold. And yes, she's cold to the touch. He starts working his fingers up towards her neck to take a pulse. And Trout goes, no. I don't want my wife touched. I'm upset right now. I can't believe this is happening. He feigns tears. He pretends that he's upset, blah, blah, blah. The doctor says, okay, no problem. They go to the county and contact them and lets them know that there's been a death. And they do an examination, and it's determined that she died due to childbirth. Now, Elva had been under the care of Dr. Knapp for the last 2 or 3 weeks so before she died. And since he knew that she was ill, rather more so than normal, be it that when a woman is pregnant with a child, he just wrote on the death certificate, childbirth or natural causes. Didn't really much think anything about it. And that was all she wrote. Her body was prepped for burial, and they had her funeral. You had several dozen mourners attend, including her mother, Mary Jane. Now, normally, when somebody dies nowadays, it depends on what county you die in and the circumstances under which your death happened, whether an autopsy is done or not. Some counties are more strict with others in terms of when they do an autopsy, why they do an autopsy. Some counties are very stretched for manpower with medical examiners, so they just forego the autopsy unless something unusual about the death, whether it be a drug overdose, so forth and so on. Now, mind you, even though we are talking about the 19th century going into the 20th century, autopsies, those days are still performed. We've actually been doing autopsies for literally thousands of years, and every year tens of thousands of people around the country, around the world, donate their bodies to science to further advance technology when it comes to medical and autopsy procedures. However, this time, Dr. Knapp said she was sick. I was seeing to her care for the last 2 weeks, and she died of childbirth complications. So here's where the story takes a very unusual and odd turn. You're going to fast forward a few months later. Mary Jane Heaster, the mother of Elva, is sleeping. And she has a dream that her daughter comes to her. And she's just standing there. She's calling out her name. She wakes up the next day, goes about doing her chores, what have you. The next night, she goes to sleep and she has the same, almost a vivid dream of her daughter calling out her name. She wakes up the next morning again. This dream is a little bit different. It's almost like my daughter was standing at the foot of my bed. I guess you can just call it a dream, right? She goes to bed, but this time it is no dream. She wakes up, and standing at the foot of her bed is her daughter. And her daughter tells her,
Mother. don't believe them. I was murdered. Erasmus killed me. We got into a fight because I didn't have dinner prepared. He strangled me. I couldn't breathe. He wouldn't let go of me. Don't let him get away with this.
Miss Heaster wakes up out of bed. She feels it in her heart. Did my daughter come to me in my dreams? Did this actually happen? Have you ever had a dream where you wake up and you just swear up and down that it happened? This is real. I really won the lottery, whatever your dream is. Well, that's what she experienced, but she knew in her heart that she was not dreaming. She knew her daughter came to her. Her daughter's spirit came to her and told her that it was her husband, Trout, who killed her. Mary Jane Heaster comes down here with the mission. She must talk to the prosecutor. She gets down here, goes into the prosecutor's office, and demands to speak to him immediately. After a little bit of arguing with the secretary, she gets into the office of a man by the name of John Alfred Preston. Then he was the prosecutor here in Greenbrier County. Okay, ma'am, what seems to be the problem? And she says, I know I'm gonna sound crazy, and I'm already waiting for you to tell me I am. But Elva came to me in a dream and told me that her husband, Trout, killed her. Okay, so I'm sure this guy rolls his eyes and he's looking at her like, okay. Sure, a ghost came to you and told you that her husband killed her. And he just kind of just shrugs it off, and she says, no, I'm serious. She goes, you must believe me. I'm not crazy. This was not a dream. She came to me. Now, normally, Mr. Preston would have just threw her out of the office. You're crazy. You're delirious. You just had a daughter that died. You're still in mourning. You're dreaming things. Except, Mr. Preston was not quite satisfied at all with the resolution of what took place. Because see, Trout wasn't from this county. He was from a different part of West Virginia. And Trout was a widow before he met Elva. He had a previous wife die after she fell from a haystack. And Trout was acting awfully funny at the funeral. He would stand by his wife's coffin and not let anyone near the head of it. People thought that was strange. People thought that was odd. He has a sneaking suspicion that Trout might be responsible for Elva's murder. But then again, Dr. Knapp, who was under his care, said that she died of natural causes or childbirth related issues. So there's really no reason to disinter her and do another examination. Nonetheless, when you couple the fact that this woman is in your office crying that her daughter came from the grave and her spirit told you who killed her, along with the fact, again, of course, of his sneaking suspicion, you couple that together, immediately Mr. Preston contacts Dr. Knapp and says, hey, we're thinking about disinterring Elva and doing an autopsy. So he asks them, he says, when you examined her, you didn't see anything weird or unusual or odd on her body? And Dr. Knapp says, you know what, to tell you the truth, by the time I got there, she was already dead. And I mean, when I seen the body, it already looked like she was being prepared for burial. I did a quick examination, but when I was trying to examine her head, Mr. Shue, Trout, got really like get out of here. Like, I don't want this happening. I'm upset right now. He says, actually, I didn't do a proper examination. And again, the autopsy wasn't done. So they go to the cemetery, they disinter Elva, they take her to a schoolhouse out here, and they do an autopsy. And guess what you found out in the autopsy? Well, they're looking at the neck and they notice that her windpipe is crushed. Okay, that's interesting. And when they look closely at the neck, they can see fingerprints or bruising around her throat. And then they open up the back of her neck and they notice that the first and second vertebrae are broken and they have torn ligaments in and around the neck. So all of a sudden, this turns from a death, be it from natural causes or childbirth, to a homicide. And immediately, Trout is arrested and goes on trial for his wife's murder. And this is the courthouse where that trial took place. This is where the trial started on June 22nd, 1897. Trout goes on trial for the first-degree murder of his wife, Elva. Now, the prosecution's plan to convict Trout of the murder simply lies in the evidence itself of the autopsy that took place the previous few weeks ago. However, the defense, well, they're going to have a pretty good defense because they're going to call Mary Jane Heaster onto the stand. Well, this lady claims that she was visited by her dead daughter's spirit and told her that Trout killed her. The prosecution lays their case. They show the autopsy findings. They also mention the fact that Trout had a previous wife who died under unusual circumstances. They later the defense calls Mary Jane to the stand. Okay, so the defense is going to nail this woman. You mean to tell me, Miss Heaster, that your daughter came from the grave and told you that my client killed her? And she said, yeah, that's pretty much what happened. Now, the defense attorney, believing that he was going to discredit this woman, his plan totally backfired. Because even though he was badgering her with questions and accusations and bringing up her past and even mentioning that her daughter had a child out of wedlock, she never once wavered from the story. The story always remained the same. She was quite convincing, to say the least. So convincing that a 12-person jury found him guilty on July 11th of that year. He was found guilty of the murder of his wife, and he was sentenced to life in prison to be served in Moundsville, West Virginia. He only served about 3 years of his prison sentence because he died of unknown complications from possibly tuberculosis or smallpox, because it was going around back then. He died in 1903, and he was buried in an unmarked grave on the prison ground cemetery. Coincidentally enough, me never being here in this town, Lewisburg, of all places that I could have parked to do this vlog, I happened to literally, and I mean literally, park right in front, not even 10 feet away. I parked right in front of this grave. And by happenstance, this is the grave of Mr. John Alfred Preston. This is the prosecutor who prosecuted Erasmus Shue for the murder of his wife, Elva. I parked right in front of this. Very eerie. Okay, now we're going to take a trip to the final resting place of Elva Zona Heaster. And here we are at our final stop. We are at the Soul Chapel Methodist Church Cemetery. And you could imagine about a little over 120 years ago, there were dozens and dozens of mourners in this very cemetery grieving over the grave of Elva Zona Heaster. And you could imagine, just looking around here, that honestly, I don't believe much has changed in all those years. This all probably looks somewhat the same. And this is the final resting place. This is Elva Zona Heaster Shue. I do not know why she was buried with her married last name. Elva was her first name, but friends and family called her Zona. And of course, this grave is relatively new, and people still come to leave trinkets and stuff like that. A very unusual case, to say the least, and some believe, some don't believe. Maybe her mother lied. Maybe her mother said, oh yeah, she came to me in a dream or what have you, just to get them to do something, because maybe she knew that Trout killed her daughter. And if you see right here, you can see this is Mary Jane Heaster and J.H. Heaster. The stories online did not mention a father in this story, but there are both the parents. Regardless of the fact that this poor girl was brutally murdered, and that justice was served. I do believe that this is one of the more unusual stories that I've done a vlog on. Oftentimes when you read about old stories such as this, stories that happened in the 19th and 18th century, a lot of different people writing blogs or doing videos on YouTube will often sometimes over embellish a little bit in the story or the subject that they're speaking of. I try to read as many different articles as I can, and one article would say this, another article would say that. I tried to keep the facts as straight as I could, and I hope that to any and all who go online and watch the video, if I got something wrong, it was because there was an article written about it that maybe the next article that you will read after that did not have. Leave a comment below. You tell me. Did Zona really come and visit her mother from the grave to tell her who killed her? It's a very fascinating tale. I am Lamont at large. Thank you for watching. I will catch up with you on the next video. Peace out.